So, hi. So, on Thursday, I made a video about Julius Malema. I made a video about Julius Malema right after his sentencing. So, Julius Malema was sentenced. Well, you can go watch that video, and I'm sure you know how many years, and I'm sure you know the Julius Malema video. If you don't, you can go watch that video. But nonetheless, I want to talk about the concept of reverse racism because a lot of people, a group of people, believe that Julius Malema is and has always been a racist, and they see this sentencing as a racist got what he deserved. So I want to talk about the concept of reverse racism because that's what they are accusing Julius Malema of, and how reverse racism has become a prominent and polarizing, might I say, topic in contemporary social discourse. It is often invoked to describe perceived discrimination against historically dominant racial groups, particularly white populations in post colonial or post apartheid societies. In South Africa, few figures embody this debate more than Julius Malema, the leader of the Economic Freedom Fighters, aka the EFF, frequently accused by critics, I'm gonna call them critics, of promoting anti-white racism. Julius Malema's rhetoric and policies have sparked intense national and international debate. Yes, so we are on the international news, everybody. However, whether these accusations hold depend largely on how racism itself is defined. So I want to make the argument that these claims of reverse racism against Malema are often based on a misunderstanding of racism as merely interpersonal prejudice rather than a structural system of power. So, and also I want to go over some of Malema's key controversies, Malema's political positions, and I want to touch on some theoretical frameworks like Steve Biko. I want to talk about Steve Biko because he did say something about this, and I also want to touch on the critical race theory. Remember the critical race theory, everybody? Yeah. So, I want to make the argument that while Malema's rhetoric is undeniably provocative, we can't deny that, it is more accurately understood as a form of radical political expression. Yeah, expression. Yeah, I said that wrong. Within a deeply unequal society than as evidence of systematic racism against white South Africans. Because black people cannot be racist, they do not have the power to be racist. I can't believe I'm saying this because I thought everybody knew. But anyways, let's get into the video and let's talk about it. I think it helps to define racism because I believe a central issue in such debates about reverse racism is about definition. So, in everyday usage, racism is often understood as any form of racial prejudice or discrimination. However, in academic fields such as sociology and critical race theory, racism is frequently conceptualized as a system of power, a system a system of power that combines prejudice with institutional dominance. This distinction is crucial because while individuals of any racial group can hold prejudiced views, systematic racism refers to entrenched patterns, okay? Patterns of inequality embedded in political, economic, and social institutions. This understanding is particularly relevant in South Africa, where apartheid institutionalized racial hierarchy, concentrating land, wealth, and political power in the hands of the white minority. Despite the former end of apartheid, we can say apartheid ended, but we know it really didn't because we are still suffering the impact of apartheid till this day. Significant structural inequalities still persist. Studies and policy discussions consistently show that land ownership capital distribution, and economic opportunity remain disproportionately skewed along racial lines. So, claims of reverse racism must be evaluated within this broader historical and structural context. Context matters, okay? Context does matter when we're talking about racism. Let's talk about what he said and what he stands for that makes him quote unquote racist, right? So, one of the most controversial aspects of Malema's political platform is his advocacy for land expropriation without compensation. This policy seeks to address the enduring legacy of colonialism and apartheid, under which the majority of the land was taken from black South Africans and transferred to white ownership. Malema and the EFF, his party, argue that redistributing land is essential for achieving economic justice and meaningful equality. Critics, particularly among white South Africans, often interpret the stance as racially motivated and discriminatory. So as the Land Act of 1913. Don't you think that was racially motivated and discriminatory? I'm just asking. However, proponents contend that the policy targets historical injustice rather than individuals based on race. In this view, land reform is not an act of racial hostility, but a structural intervention aimed at correcting deeply rooted inequalities. Again, context matters. The debate over land expropriation illustrates the tension between interpreting policies through a lens of individual fairness versus systematic redress. I'm going to call this Kiss the Boer, but I know a lot of people know what I'm talking about, and if you don't, just go look it up. So, the Kiss the Boer chant was perhaps the most widely cited evidence used to label Malema as a racist. Right. So the chant, which originated during the anti apartheid struggle, has been performed at political rallies and events, including those led by Malema. So critics argue that the phrase constitutes incitement to violence against white farmers, while supporters maintain that it is a symbolic expression of historical resistance. Again, context. South African courts have addressed this issue directly, so you can go and read this court case if you are interested. In 2022, the Equality Court ruled that the chant does not constitute hate speech, emphasizing the importance of historical and political context. This decision was upheld by the Supreme Court of Appeal in 2024 and ultimately affirmed by the Constitutional Court of South Africa in 2025. That is the highest court of the land, which dismissed an appeal seeking to classify the chant as unlawful. The court concluded that the song is a form of political expression rooted in the liberation struggle and should not be interpreted literally as a call to violence. And legal experts have underscored that context is central in hate speech cases. The court's ruling suggests that within the South African constitutional framework, historical struggle songs occupy a protected space as symbolic political speech. This does not mean they are uncontroversial or universally accepted, but it does challenge the claim that their use constitutes straightforward evidence of racism. Let's go back to our friend critical race theory, because I do believe, importantly, critical race theory distinguishes between formal equality and substantive equality. So, formal equality refers to the idea that everyone is treated the same under the law, while substantive equality focuses on the outcomes and lived realities. So, in post apartheid South Africa, formal equality has largely been achieved, right? We have racial discrimination has been illegal, and all citizens have equal political rights. However, substantive equality remains elusive, as evidenced by the persistent disparities in wealth, land ownership, and access to opportunity. This distinction helps explain why policies that appear unequal on the surface, such as race conscious redistribution, may be justified as efforts to achieve deeper, more meaningful equality. I do believe when we are talking about this reverse racism, a lot of people like to throw around, oh, South Africa has more racial laws than it did during apartheid, because those laws are meant to correct what apartheid did. They're trying to correct what apartheid did. So they're trying to achieve equality, real equality. So within this framework of critical race theory, the concept of reverse racism becomes analytically weak. If racism is understood as a system of structural advantage and disadvantage, then isolated instances of prejudice against members of a historically dominant group do not constitute racism in the same sense, right? They may be morally objectionable, yeah, or socially harmful. Yes, someone can hurt your feelings. Yes, someone can discriminate you in some sense, right? But they do not carry the same systematic weight or historical backing. Critical race theory reframes the debate. Rather than asking whether individuals feel targeted, it asks how power is distributed and maintained across society. So, applying this to the case of Julius Malema, his rhetoric and policies can be interpreted through a structural lens rather than a purely interpersonal one. His calls for land redistribution, for example, align with critical race theory's emphasis on addressing historical injustice and structural inequality. Similarly, controversies such as Kiss the Boer, I'm not going to say the word, the Kiss the Boer chant must be understood within their historical and political context rather than being evaluated solely as literal statements, right? Context matters, context. So, this does not mean that Malema's rhetoric is beyond criticism. No, you can criticize him. Yeah, because critical race theory does not endorse all forms of political expression. But it does suggest that labeling such rhetoric as racist without considering structural context risks misunderstanding function and meaning. And here's my thing, right? Here's my thing. The case of Julius Malema, the whole case of him being racist, not the firearm case. This case illustrates the broader conceptual problem with the idea of reverse racism. If racism is understood primarily as systematic power, then the notion of reversing it becomes problematic. It doesn't make sense. Because while white South Africans may experience prejudice or discrimination in certain contexts, I'm not debating that. I am not debating that, right? These experiences do not occur within a system that systematically disadvantages them as a racial group in the same way apartheid disadvantaged black South Africans, because policies such as land reform or affirmative action are generally designed as corrective measures aimed at reducing inequality. They are not establishing new forms of racial domination, and critics may disagree with their implementation or effectiveness. Do that. I don't have a problem with people, criticizing or critiquing certain laws. I don't have a problem do that. But labeling them as racist risks obscuring their intended purpose and the structural conditions they seek to address. And I talked about Steve Biko in the introduction of this video, and I wanted to talk about a bit of what he said, or rather quote him. So anti-apartheid activist Steve Biko said in his book, I Write What I Like, those who know define racism as discrimination by a group against another for the purpose of subjugation or maintaining subjugation. In other words, one cannot be racist unless he has the power to subjugate. So ultimately, Julius Malema remains one of the most controversial figures in South African politics, and his rhetoric often pushes the boundaries of acceptable discourse. And I do think that is because he is not afraid to say it as it is, and as unpresentable as it is, he says it. However, the claim that he represents reverse racism is not supported when racism is understood as a structural phenomenon rooted in power and historical context. Drawing from the theoretical frameworks such as the critical race theory and those advanced by Steve Biko, as well as legal interpretations of the South African courts by the South African courts, it becomes clear that Malema's actions are better understood as part of an ongoing struggle over inequality, land, and economic justice. This does not mean that all of Malema's statements are beyond criticism. No, criticize the man all you like. On the contrary, some have been rightly challenged and even condemned. Yet, reducing his politics to racism oversimplifies a complex reality and risks conflating individual offense with systematic oppression. Don't confuse the two. Just because someone felt offended by what he said does not mean that he's being racist. Ultimately, the debate over reverse racism in South Africa reveals less about Malema himself. Yeah, I'm going to say this, and more about enduring intentions of a society that is still grappling with the legacy of apartheid. Those are my 2 cents regarding reverse racism. Yes, I said reverse racism because black people do not have the power to be racist, therefore, cannot be racist. Because they don't have the power to. And I did talk about this in the South African context, but I do believe that it can be applied to any place, to any country that struggles with the same things that we struggle with in South Africa. So if you made it to the end of the video, thank you very much for watching. I hope you like, I hope you share, I hope you subscribe. If you like the video, do like it. If you want to watch more of those videos, I have a lot more about South African politics. You can subscribe and watch more. Yeah, I'm going to leave you there and I will catch you in the next one. Bye.